Yeah, welcome back. You're still watching Business Incorporated here on Channels Television. The World Bank has said that 8 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are in debt distress already, and 14 at high risk of joining them. The bank said the countries are part of 38 countries eligible for the International Development Association, that's the IDA loans. Countries in Sub-Saharan Africa include Nigeria, yours truly, Angola, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Chad, Ethiopia, and others. What does this mean for these countries? Can this be averted? Can they escape being in debt distress? Well, we'll have Matt Kindiger joining us now. He's practice lead, Sub-Saharan Africa for Front of You. Hi, Matt. Good afternoon. Which countries, when you saw these stories, which of the countries are you most worried about, thinking about public debts and debt distress?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on the show today. So this is something that we're watching very closely here at Front of You, and this is because we have seen very significant fiscal pressures emerge since even before the COVID pandemic, and we're seeing a lot of fiscal vulnerabilities being really pronounced by the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine in terms of the countries that we're most worried about. So it's worth remembering that Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique are already in default, and these countries face very extreme fiscal pressures and chronic fiscal pressures. But the countries that are the most at risk in terms of entering distress or facing more fiscal distress are Ghana, which has endured a number of credit rating downgrades over the last couple of months, and this has resulted in its debt servicing costs rise significantly, not least because its currency has depreciated. Kenya, I'm also quite worried about Kenya because the country's debt profile has deteriorated quite steadily over the last couple of years, and we expect to see a bit of a fiscal crunch emerge over the next 3 to 6 months. So this will pose a very significant challenge for the new Ruto administration. And Ethiopia, as you mentioned in your introduction, also a country we're worried about because of the drain on public finances caused by the civil war, which has been going on for more than a year now. So certainly a number of countries that we're quite worried about. To a lesser extent, South Africa and Nigeria are 2 countries as well that are facing fiscal pressures, but I would say Kenya, Ghana, and Ethiopia are the most worrying at the moment.
I'm sure a lot of our viewers just heave a sigh of relief that, oh, I thought Nigeria was going to be in that very red list, even though, of course, Nigeria does have its own challenges dealing with debts, especially with the budgets we just talked about, increases debt servicing and the risk of borrowing. But, so do we expect a wave of defaults across maybe among some of these countries you've mentioned or across Africa?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Nigeria. So Nigeria has 2 things in its favor, which means it will most likely avoid a default. One is that public debt is actually quite low as a percentage of GDP compared to other countries in Africa. But also it will benefit from very high global oil prices, which we expect here at Front of You to continue to rise over the next quarter. So certainly that will provide a bit of a lifeline. In terms of the other countries that we've talked about, so the good news is that we think defaults are unlikely, at least before the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And this is because we think that the countries that are most at risk, especially Ghana and to an extent Kenya, will, if necessary, if they face a real squeeze, will end up getting an IMF support. They'll also get some form of debt forgiveness. We do expect to see international lenders extending credit terms, for example. But we're also going to see certain countries that would normally or would otherwise face quite significant debt pressures, such as South Africa and Angola, benefiting from very high commodity prices. South Africa's public finances have received a real lifeline from high global iron ore and coal prices. The government benefits from taxing these industries, so it has been able to boost its revenue. And also Angola's fiscal position has turned around quite significantly as a result of very high oil prices. It's worth remembering that only last year it came within about 2 weeks of defaulting on its debt, and it now is in a much better fiscal position. But the longer we look out to the future, the more likely there is a risk of default. For example, Ghana, if it doesn't get an IMF deal over the next few months, could actually default on its loans.
Wow. So is there a way of escape? What should governments be doing now to try to deal with this debt pressure?
Yeah, so I think this is the this is the thing we're really going to be focusing on a lot here at Frontier View over the next couple of months is I think a lot of governments are going to have to face the music, so to speak. There's going to be effectively much broader austerity measures across the region. So we've had a number of elections across the region. Well, Nigeria has an election coming up in 2023. Kenya's just had an election. Zimbabwe has an election next year. So especially, the countries that have passed elections will probably see much more significant austerity measures, reductions in spending, limits on capital investment. We're also going to see governments become a lot more aggressive in tax collection and trying to expand the tax base. So certainly more taxes, less spending growth. We're also going to see things like civil service wage increases, which for many governments are a significant burden on their budget, will probably begin to deteriorate somewhat. So we're going to see a bit of pressure on civil service wages. But we're also going to see governments increasingly turn towards international organizations like the IMF. So certainly we would see Kenya probably a candidate for more IMF support, for example. And in Ethiopia's case, the civil war is probably going to be one reason. Well, the fiscal pressures the government is facing is one of the reasons why we think the government will try to find an end to the civil war, for example. So there will certainly be a number of changes that we're going to see from a fiscal perspective. So governments, in order to avoid default.
All right, smart. Well, obviously, those assistance from the international community also comes with some condition. I know Egypt, for instance, is dealing with a request to devalue its currency, so. But anyway, as you said, as you're watching in front of you, we're also watching here in channels. Thank you so much, Matt, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, you as well.